Okay, hello everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So on behalf of the International Center for Counter-Terrorism in The Hague, I'd like to welcome you to today's live briefing. The topic, of course, is the repatriation of foreign fighters and their families. Why not? My name is Julie Coleman. I'm a senior research fellow here at ICCT, and I'll be chairing today's briefing. So as a start, I'm going to introduce the speakers and then just go over a couple of very quick housekeeping issues, and then we will go ahead and fully get started into the conversation. So first up today is Anthony Dworkin. He's a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, working on human rights, democracy, and international order, with a particular focus on the Middle East and North Africa. Anthony has written widely on the European and US response to international terrorism, amongst other subjects. He's also a visiting lecturer at the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po and was formerly executive director of the Crimes of War Project. Next up, we have Dr. Christophe Paulussen, who's a senior researcher at the TMC Asser Institute. And he's also coordinator of its research strand, Human Dignity and Human Security in International and European Law. He's coordinator of the Interfaculty Research Platform, International Humanitarian and Criminal Law Platform, and he's been a research fellow at ICCT since 2011. Before that, he was an assistant professor at Tilburg University, and Christophe's areas of interest are international humanitarian law, international criminal law, in particular the law of international criminal tribunals, as well as counterterrorism and human rights, with a particular focus on foreign fighters. And last, but certainly not least, we have Tanya Mehra, who's a senior research fellow also at ICCT. And with a background in international law, Tanya is involved in conducting research, providing evidence-based policy advice, and advising governments on a rule of law-based approach to counterterrorism. And she previously worked at TMC Asser Institute. And before I also do the brief housekeeping, I wanted to introduce ICCT and our work to those who maybe are not yet familiar. ICCT is an independent think and do tank based in The Hague, and we work to provide research, evidence-based policy advice, and practical on-the-ground solutions on matters regarding counterterrorism and PCVE. And we have a particular focus on prevention and the rule of law. So today's live briefing will examine the case for European, and I think also we'll discuss other governments to repatriate foreign fighters and their families. Topics that will be covered include how serious are the problems posed by repatriation, how those can be overcome, what are the prospects for prosecuting individuals once they return, and also why have European and other governments been so slow to act, as well as if there are viable alternatives that we maybe would want to consider. So the discussion today is based on two papers, which I hope you've already had the chance to read, or if you have not yet read them, that after today's briefing, you can go ahead and take a look. The first is The Repatriation of Foreign Fighters and Their Families, Options, Obligations, Morality, and Long-Term Thinking by Tanya Mehra and Christophe Paulussen, and Beyond Good and Evil, Why Europe Should Bring ISIS Foreign Fighters Home by Anthony Dworkin. And finally, for the housekeeping matters, of course, we're going to pop up on your screen a live poll just to gauge sort of initial reactions to the issue of repatriation. If you could go ahead and answer that quickly before we get started, that will really help us. After each of the speakers present, there will be a 20 to 25 minute Q&A session, and we'd ask that you submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function rather than the chat function. That will just help us on our end keep things a little bit more organized. We're going to try to cover as many questions as we can, but just to note that the recording of today's session is going to be made available to everybody attending today, so the link will be sent out to you after the session has concluded. And finally, once you leave the session, you'll be asked to fill out a very, very brief post-event survey, and we just ask that you provide us with some feedback to help us improve future events. And with that, I think I will go ahead and turn it over to Anthony.
Great, thank you very much, Julie, and thanks to the ICCT for hosting this event. I'm really pleased to be here talking on this subject. And you know, I'm glad that this subject is continuing to receive public attention, because I think there is a danger that the people that we're going to be discussing, the the men, women, and children from all around the world who are detained as foreign fighters or families in Syria could become the kind of forgotten people. And for all the reasons we're going to discuss today, I think it's important that that shouldn't happen. So I'm going to begin by giving a little bit of the sort of political context. And this problem, the problem of the foreign fighters and their families detained in Syria, is a problem that the countries of the world should have seen coming, because thousands and thousands of people from all around the world were flocking to Iraq and Syria during the period when ISIS, the Islamic State, was at its height. And these people were obviously there, and as the forces, the coalition fighting against ISIS, recaptured the territory, it became clear that large numbers of these people would be falling into the hands of the coalition, and in particular the ground forces, which was the Syrian Democratic Forces, this Kurdish-led group that was leading the ground fight against ISIS. And so this question was always looming: what would happen to them? And yet it's more than a year since the last part of territory held by ISIS was recaptured, and in the case of some countries around the world, they have taken their people back, but many countries, including the vast majority of countries in Europe, have not, and there is this persistent problem. So how many people are we talking about? Well, the figures vary, but it's upwards of 10,000 women and children and a few thousand men who are being held. They're being held in makeshift conditions. The Syrian Democratic Forces that captured them, it's a non-state group. It doesn't have the capabilities of a state to be able to handle and process numbers of people on this scale. And crucially, it also doesn't have, as an attribute of statehood, because it's not a state, it doesn't have a kind of internationally recognized legal system, and it doesn't have extradition treaties with other countries. And so they've been held in these kind of impromptu makeshift conditions, which have turned into indefinite conditions. So the men are in these kind of pop-up prisons, or in some cases larger prisons, but very limited facilities. The women and children are held in these large refugee camps. They tend to be overcrowded with very little by way of medical care or education. And these conditions, which seem designed for a short-term, kind of filling the gap operation, have become a kind of quasi-indefinite way of keeping these people. So, I've looked particularly at the response of European countries. We're talking about 400 to 500 adults and 700, 750 children from Europe. And the Europeans tend to say, we think that as a matter of principle, these people should be tried in the region where they committed their crimes. And that certainly goes at least for the men and also the women. Adult women are regarded as having committed crimes by going to join this terrorist group and kind of helping its operations, even if they weren't directly fighting. So, that sounds on the one hand like a principled stance, that they should be tried where their crimes were committed. But in practice, I think it's not so much a principled stance as what I describe in my paper as a policy of externalization. I think it's really driven by the imperative of European countries keeping their citizens away rather than bringing them back to try them at home. We've seen, I think the reason for that is we haven't seen any kinds of trials in the region materialize. As I said, it's been more than a year. And we're no further forward. And, a number of options have been kind of floated: an international tribunal, trials in Iraq. The Syrian Democratic Forces might try these people themselves for various reasons, which we could go into in the Q&A. None of these options have panned out. And so, the situation is simply dragging on, and the people there are essentially left in limbo. What has happened is countries have begun to bring back the children, and clearly the humanitarian case for bringing children back is extremely strong, and they're not thought to pose as much of a threat and there's no element of kind of guilt or culpability on the part of the children. That's widely accepted. European countries say there may be some threats involved, but they're outweighed by the humanitarian cases. But the children that have been brought back are overwhelmingly unaccompanied children, unaccompanied minors, which means either orphans or in those cases where the parents are willing to give their consent for the children to be taken home without them. That's happened also in a few cases. So that's a really small number of the children that are there. We see them coming back either where there's an extreme medical need or in some cases where the parents consent. Yesterday, France took back a group of 10 children. So in these kind of small dribs and drabs, a number of children are coming home, but it remains comparatively few. And beyond that, one or two European countries have brought back single parents. Italy took back a foreign fighter and is going to put him on trial. Germany has taken, in some cases, mothers with children, but it remains politically very contentious. So what are the drivers of this policy? Well, European governments say that there are a number of problems to do with legal problems, security problems to do with bringing them back, and my fellow panelists are going to discuss that in a minute. But what I want to point to is what I see as a big factor here, which is the political obstacles to bringing them home. It remains, if you look at the opinion polls, overwhelmingly unpopular among European publics to bring these people home. And we've seen in a number of cases, real political problems arising when governments have taken even very small steps. So in the case of Finland, there's been a certain degree of confusion and controversy within the coalition government in Finland about some kind of communications that came out of the government about how they were examining a policy of bringing back some adults. In the case of Norway, the coalition government almost fell when one woman was brought back at the beginning of this year with children. So it remains politically quite difficult, I think. And as part of my research, I've spoken to government officials in a number of these countries. And what they tend to say is essentially that they recognize, kind of off the record, that there is a strong case for bringing them back, that no other options are materializing, but that it's, at a political level, ministers are very reluctant to take that step. And as one official said to me, there is this sense that the responsibility, while the people are there in the camps, the responsibility is quite diffuse. But if a government is to take a positive, active decision, or even an individual minister, to bring back those people, and then one of them is involved in a terrorist incident, then the kind of political responsibility is very clear. So I think that as part of the effort of thinking how to change the policy, if we believe that it should be changed, I think it is a question of kind of mobilizing some sort of campaign that's going to change the political opinions within the government. And again, I think my fellow panelists will discuss this more, but I would just end by emphasizing what seemed to me, some of the reasons why. First of all, I think there are issues that are clearly humanitarian issues, that there is, in the case of the children, they're living in these very difficult conditions, and also the women and children, the women and the men, foreign fighters, are also being held in, very, very really difficult conditions where basic human rights are not being met. And that's part of it, but I think there's also a security case for bringing them back. And we saw that indeed in the latter part of last year when there was a Turkish incursion into the part of Syria where these camps are. And, in some cases, the camps were affected by fighting. One of the refugee camps, Ain Issa, several hundred people escaped or were released in the course of the fighting. And while that fighting has died down, it remains geopolitically a very kind of fraught and contentious part of the world. In addition, there's been consistent stories of people being smuggled out of the camps, people trying to escape, possibilities that as ISIS recovers its strength, it might try to break people out. So I think there's also a security case. And because, of course, if the people are released, smuggled out of the camps, then what happens is they make their way to Turkey and then they're able to come back home. So I think the case is quite strong for having a kind of managed and controlled process of return rather than leaving them in this very insecure situation where they are now. So that I think is the case, but as I say, the political obstacles remain severe. There are countries around the world which have taken a different approach. Several countries in Central Asia and a number of countries in the Western Balkans, Bosnia and Kosovo, have taken back significant numbers, particularly of women and children. There are some questions about the reintegration programs in those cases, but there haven't been big security problems associated with them. So I will end there and pass on to my colleagues who I think are going to look at some of these questions in more detail.
Thank you, Anthony. And before I start, I would like to thank Julie for a kind introduction and for moderating, and Antoinette van den Berg, Office Manager and Head of Communications at ICCT, for organizing this webinar. May I have slide 1, please? So in June 2018, I co-authored together with Willem van Knuchten and Bibi van Ginkel an op-ed in the Dutch newspaper De Volkskrant, appealing to the Dutch government to take back the children of Dutch Islamic State or IS fighters. And quite a bit has changed in those 2 years. The caliphate, as we once knew it, has collapsed. And the discussion on what to do with the former IS residents, now being detained in Syrian camps, has broadened to the children's fathers and mothers. However, one important thing has not changed, and that is that generally speaking, Western governments, including my own and the Netherlands, are extremely reluctant to repatriate. They only do so in the politically safest cases, such as bringing back orphans, or when they are simply forced to act, for example, through court orders. And in the following 10 minutes or so, I will address the issue of non-repatriation from an international legal, a security, and a moral point of view. And I will conclude that repatriation is what should be pursued rather today than tomorrow. Now, first, the international legal dimension. Is there an international legal obligation to repatriate? Now, although states have quite some discretion under the concept of consular assistance to decide on the scope of assistance they give to their nationals abroad, there are several obligations under international law arguing in favor of repatriation. And I will only give 2 examples here. One example related to the adults is the obligation under various UN Security Council resolutions such as 1373, 2178, and 2396 to bring terrorists and foreign terrorist fighters more specifically to justice. And this obligation clashes, of course, with the decision to look away and just leave the men and women, many of whom joined a terrorist organization, in camps, hoping that other entities will do something about it. Especially if those other entities, the Kurds, have backed the countries of origin to take their responsibility. So tired by the passivity of these countries, the Kurds have announced that they will try the male fighters themselves, but this does not solve the issue of the women, of course. And moreover, there are various legal obstacles to trials before Kurdish courts, and in any case, these cases have been indefinitely postponed due to COVID-19. Hence, the urgency to repatriate and try terrorism suspects before properly functioning courts still remains. Now, the current inaction, in my view, is a clear obstacle to fight impunity for terrorism and other international crimes, and constitutes a clear affront to the victims of the crimes of IS, who very understandably want justice to be done. Now, all of this doesn't mean, of course, that prosecution in the West is not without its challenges, but that will be addressed by my colleague Tanya Mehra in her presentation. The second example relates to the specific position and needs of children. So according to Article 3 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CRC, states undertake to ensure the child such protection and care as is necessary for his or her well-being, and the best interests of the child shall be primary consideration. Article 39 states that states parties shall take all appropriate measures to promote physical and psychological recovery and social reintegration of a child victim of, among other things, armed conflicts. And then the provision continues. Such recovery and reintegration shall take place in an environment which fosters the health, self-respect, and dignity of the child, Well, it's clear, of course, that the camps do not form such an environment, and that's an understatement. Many children have already died because of the horrible humanitarian situation, and COVID-19 may make the situation even worse. The second dimension is the security dimension. Also from a security dimension, and perhaps politicians are more amenable to these kinds of arguments, repatriation of the foreign fighters and the families is arguably the best solution. Of course, bringing back people who have spent time with IS is not without risks. If not properly monitored, they could be involved in attacks, thereby using their combat skills acquired in the Levant. Nonetheless, the risks are arguably even greater, and this has also been established empirically by people like David Mallet, who have worked for years on the topic of foreign fighters, when nothing is done with these people at all, as is currently the case. As also explained by Anthony, the camps are overcrowded and its detainees prone to further radicalization and recruitment while being in legal limbo. And countries must be very careful not to create a Camp Bucca 2.0, named after the infamous Iraqi detention center, which played an important role in the establishment of IS in the first place. In addition, persons may disappear off the radar and may be set free after questionable trials, thus not only escaping true justice, but also creating a direct security problem for the countries and the people in the region, and an indirect security problem for other countries and their people, to which they may relocate unseen at a later stage. As regards children, now that many of them are still of very young age, childcare specialists have indicated that the security risks are truly minimal and that they are still able to treat them. However, they've also warned that the longer we wait and the older they get, the more difficult this task will become. And so instead of looking away from what has been described as ticking time bombs, the longer we wait and the more trauma these children will have to endure, the more realistic it will be that ticking time bombs are actually being created by the current state passivity. So therefore, a controlled repatriation, prosecution, rehabilitation and reintegration and further monitoring if needed would be a bolder, but also a far wiser approach from a long-term security perspective for all countries and peoples involved. And this is not just my opinion, so almost all security experts agree on this point. So can I have slide 2, please? Here you can see a 2009 open letter to Western governments from several well-known national security professionals, including people like Richard Barrett, former director of global counterterrorism at MI6 in the UK, and Brett McCurk, the former special presidential envoy to the global coalition to defeat ISIS, arguing that the current hands-off stance of Western governments will only create greater danger in the future. Slide 3, please. And here in a 2018 memo of the Netherlands Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism, it was also stressed that it's safe for national security to bring the children back. As regards the adults, it was stated that there are certainly risks involved in repatriation, but at least that these are controllable. And finally, also from a moral standpoint, repatriation is arguably the right thing to do. And this is an international problem that should be responded to in an equally international manner, characterized by solidarity and with states by taking care of their own foreign fighters and their families, sharing and dividing responsibility, thus making the bigger and seemingly insurmountable problem smaller and thus more manageable. Similar to the equally problematic counterterrorism measure of deprivation of nationality, non-repatriation entails looking away, putting your head in the sand, shoving the hot potato around and hoping that others, and we should also not forget that the Kurds have already done the lion's share in the front line against the threat of IS, will solve the risk created by what are, in essence, the products of our own society, and namely the men and women that grew up and radicalized here in the West, as was also aptly described by the former Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bert Koenders. Slide 4, please. So to conclude, I'm very aware that repatriation and subsequent prosecution have their own challenges, but these should not be used in any way to undermine what is now the right thing to do from an international legal, security, and moral point of view, and that is to repatriate and prosecute. So thank you, and Tanya, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Anthony and Christophe, for setting the scene and explaining why we should repatriate foreign fighters and their families. And the next question is, what happens when they are back? Will they freely walk around or will they be prosecuted? And what about the children? I'll briefly illustrate the possibilities that are available I'll first distinguish between the children and their parents. I will explain for which type of crimes the foreign fighters can be prosecuted and how evidence can be collected to make a successful case. If time allows, I will explore the use of administrative measures in the context of FTFs. The next slide, please. So over 75 of the children in Syria and Iraq were born there and are under the age of 7. These children are victims, and as Christophe has pointed out, we should act in the best interest of the child. All children also have the right to acquire nationality. Several children who were born in IS territory have not been registered and have no nationality. Many European countries are reluctant to automatically recognize these children as their citizens. This means in practice that the children would need to establish their citizenship through a DNA test. These costs are often need to be borne by the family. So the first issue of nationality has to be addressed. We also see that family courts are increasingly being involved with radicalized children. And although family courts may not be as accustomed with dealing with these issues, such as radicalization and violent extremism, they can play a role in placing children upon return in custody of the state. In the Netherlands, the Board of Child Protection has already developed individual plans for each and every child that is known to the authorities, including where they would be placed upon return. Other options are also available, such as continued monitoring, the appointment of a guardian, or travel restrictions. So according to Article 9 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, children can be separated from their parents if there is physically or mentally brought into danger. The focus for the children should indeed be on the rehabilitation and reintegration. This is an avenue that European countries could further explore. So now let's turn to the parents, which are often the mothers. So what can we do in terms of prosecution? So the perception of the involvement of women in jihad has evolved considerably. During the first wave of returns, women were perceived as victims or as playing a limited logistical role and being overall harmless. As a result, they were not prosecuted to the same extent as men. This has now changed entirely, following a more accurate but also enlarged understanding of the role of women in conflict, but also because of the broadening of terrorist laws to cover support activities. So since 2016, women are more likely to, are just as likely to be prosecuted as men. So in most of the European countries, the criminal justice approach prevails. When it comes to the prosecution of returning FTFs, one can see that the number of prosecutions have increased since 2014. And this is partly due to the fact that many countries have, since the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2178, amended their criminal laws and broadened the scope of terrorist activities. So for what for crimes are FTFs being prosecuted and what are their options? So let's start and look at the ordinary crimes. The first two FTFs in the Netherlands were in fact prosecuted for attempted murder and arson. So they were prosecuted on the basis of ordinary crimes. The second option is terrorist-related offenses. The most common is membership of a terrorist organization. And this has been now criminalized in most European countries, with the exception of Sweden and Finland. So we see that many FTFs have been prosecuted on the basis of membership. The third option is international crimes. In the last few years, we see a steady increase of prosecutions of foreign fighters for international crimes in Europe. Countries like Sweden, Finland, France, Germany, and the Netherlands have been prosecuting or have ongoing prosecutions on the basis of international crimes. And this could be war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. Just to give you a few examples, a Syrian national who participated in extrajudicial killings of 7 persons was convicted for a war crime in Sweden. And the UN has indicated that crimes committed by IS against the Yazidi community amount to genocide. And in fact, in Frankfurt, an Iraqi man has gone on trial last month for genocide and other crimes on allegations that he, as an IS member, has been part of an effort to exterminate the Yazidi community. And finally, I also want to just point out that foreign fighters can be prosecuted for sexual and gender-based violence with a terrorist intent. Here we also see a steady stream of reports indicating that the systematic sexual violence committed against the Yazidi women and girls by IS, which include rape, torture, enforced marriage, enforced pregnancy, sexual slavery, and also enforced prostitutions. These crimes can be prosecuted as international crimes, but also as under domestic law as ordinary crimes. In March of this year, an Iraqi court found Mohammed Rashid Saheb guilty of participating in a terrorist organization and in the rape and abduction of a Yazidi woman, and he was given the death penalty. So why prosecute for the crimes as international crimes? So even though the threshold can be very high, there is more and more credible evidence available to prove that these crimes have been committed. And I'll turn to that in a minute. And secondly, by prosecuting foreign fighters for the actual crimes they have committed, it helps to restore dignity to the victims. And this concern has also been raised by the Yazidi community. And third, it will also result in longer sentences. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So now let's turn to the evidence. We often hear that prosecutors are facing challenges in collecting evidence from conflict areas because it's not safe to travel to war-torn states to collect evidence. There might be no judicial cooperation agreement in place with the country where the crime has been committed, or the legitimate government may not exercise effective control over the area where the evidence is located. This is indeed all true, or I should perhaps say was true, as things are improving significantly, allowing prosecutors to collect credible and admissible evidence from conflict areas. Next slide, please. So evidence can be collected from different kinds of sources. The first would be the Commission of Inquiry in Syria, but also international mechanisms like the IIIM for Syria and UNITAD, which has been established under the Security Council resolution to collect and preserve and store evidence which can be used to prosecute alleged perpetrators. And several non-governmental organizations have been also documenting human rights abuses and making this available. For example, the Syria Justice and Accountability Center, the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights are just a few examples. And although information used from NGOs can pose certain challenges with respect to the credibility of the evidence and the equality of arms, overall, the ability to collect evidence by specialized NGOs has considerably improved. In the Netherlands, a foreign fighter has in fact been convicted for a war crime because he was posing next to a deceased person who was crucified. And the prosecutor has also relied on a report of the Commission for International Justice and Accountability. Then we have biometrics, battlefield evidence, and internet. These are three other areas that can provide useful evidence. Forensic technology, especially with regard to biometrics and DNA analysis, is advancing very fast. Fingerprints can be retrieved from physical objects, such as weapons and IEDs, and provide useful information on how the bombs have been made, but could also provide insight into the modus operandi of terrorist organizations. And the importance of biometrics for military operations has long been recognized, but is now also increasingly being used in prosecutions. To give you an example, in the UK, Sardar was sentenced to 30 years prison for manufacturing an IED, which led to the death of an American soldier. And his fingerprints were retrieved from a similar unexploded IED in the same area. So we are all aware of how terrorist organizations use internet for different purposes. I would not deny that using electronic evidence can be challenging. Electronic evidence is easily altered, it's time sensitive. The use of encryption and anonymizers and cloud computing are indeed making it difficult. But perhaps the biggest challenge is the fact that electronic evidence is stored in foreign or in multiple jurisdictions, requiring law enforcement and police to rely on formal cooperation and send mutual legal assistance requests, which is slow and time consuming. But on the other hand, through open source investigations, a lot of valuable information can be obtained. Now let us turn briefly to military evidence, also referred to as battlefield evidence. This has been, in fact, one of the areas I've been working on together with my colleagues Bibi van Ginkel and Christophe Paulussen for quite some years. So with the collapse of ISIS, the global coalition against ISIS, but also national armies, came across vital information that could be used as evidence in court. And just to give you an idea, what you can find on the battlefield, it can include documents, membership cards, cell phones, computers, or like mentioned earlier, IEDs. Now, to be able to use this kind of information as evidence in court, it must be collected, preserved, and stored properly. And this is not something that can be realized overnight. It requires training, awareness raising, not only among the military, but also among prosecutors and judges. In some countries, the laws needs to be amended to allow information collected by the military as evidence in court. Australia has already amended its laws and now permits the use of military evidence in court. Other examples include Spain, which is also planning to make amendments in their law. And at the same time, there are already countries which have successfully used military evidence to prosecute foreign fighters. In the US, for example, Mohammed Jamal Qais was sentenced to 20 years in prison for joining IS, partly on the basis of an IS intake form, which was recovered by the US military. And finally, several victims who have survived atrocities committed by IS have started to appear and have given account on what has happened, which can also contribute to bringing the perpetrators to justice. In the two cases I mentioned earlier, the victims appeared in court in Iraq and also in Frankfurt. So to conclude, it is true that prosecuting returning foreign fighters is challenging and has resulted in relatively short sentences in Europe, somewhere between 4 to 5 years. But the prospects for prosecuting returning foreign fighters is improving. Information from the conflict zone is finding its way into court, and foreign fighters are starting to be prosecuted for international crimes. And this itself is already a big step forward. In the end, we have to all take responsibility for our own foreign fighters. We need to bring foreign fighters within a rule of law framework to justice for the actual crimes they have committed using all forms of admissible evidence. And this will also contribute to restoring dignity to victims and to provide a sense of justice. So with this, I would like to hand back the floor to the moderator. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you to everyone. We'll go ahead and launch into the Q&A section now. There's still time to submit questions through the Q&A box if anybody attending wants to ask any further questions. And just to quickly summarize the results of the poll that we received, an impressive 91% of you attending today are in favor of repatriation. So very interesting numbers. So for the first question, I might perhaps direct this towards you, Anthony, and then open it up. So regarding children, given that we know children have the potential to be radicalized at a very, very young age, younger than perhaps we had first anticipated, are they not going to be ticking time bombs, so to speak, once they're brought back? And should we also be looking at who we would consider a child for the purposes of repatriation, given that there's a perhaps substantial difference between somebody who's 16 versus a child who's 6? So I will turn that over to you.
Thanks, Julie. So, you know, I think the view that most officials, policymakers, and experts would take about these children is certainly to acknowledge that there is some potential risk involved, because not surprisingly, these children, as you say, first of all, they cover a wide range of ages, and then they've lived an extraordinarily traumatic period of several years in some cases in Syria or in Iraq, and they've been exposed during that period to consistent propaganda and indoctrination by, you know, either their parents or the kind of general environment of ISIS. So I think there is a sense, you know, that it's not risk-free, and yet there are ways of trying to address the situation. I mean, generally, people believe that in the case of younger people, it's easier to try and move them away from a commitment to these kind of radical causes or radical ideologies, or a commitment to violence. So I think there's, you know, so it's a somewhat debated question how much de-radicalization works in the case of adults, but in the case of children, there is more scope, I think, because they're less kind of entrenched and their views are more changing. But the main case for bringing them back also, I think, is simply that they don't have the responsibility for their actions. So they didn't make a choice to join ISIS, or if they did when they were young and were committed to it, even so, they weren't, you know, responsible as adults for their decisions. And so I think both the sense is that, you know, that it might be easier to move them away from that commitment, but also that it's wrong, fundamentally wrong, to hold them responsible for being there, and therefore they're not criminals. They're, you know, they're victims. I mean, that's the view that we're generally told now that we take in the case of child soldiers, and in these cases, even when they have been involved in some of the fighting or the activities of ISIS, I think the same view applies here as well.
Great, thank you. So perhaps I will aim question number 2 towards you, Christophe. So the question is, given that human rights obligations are only applicable within a given country and don't have extraterritorial application, does this mean that women and children cannot claim repatriation on the basis of human rights assertions, or what would give them the right to invoke human rights obligations?
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I can understand the question. Also, if you look at the Convention of the Rights of the Child that I mentioned, it stipulates that states parties shall respect and ensure the rights set forth in the present convention to each child within their jurisdiction. And people will probably equate that word jurisdiction with territory, but jurisdiction is more than just national territory. You can, for example, think of having effective control over troops operating abroad. So it's not that treaties are strictly limited to what happens on the territory of the state party. And I think the same argument could be made here, and also the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights while countering terrorism, and the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions have mentioned this when they were discussing a general comment number 36 of the Human Rights Committee. And they argue that a state's responsibility to protect may be invoked extraterritorially in circumstances where that particular state has the capacity to protect the right to life against an immediate and foreseeable threat to life. And then the determination of whether states have acted with due diligence to protect against unlawful death is based on an assessment of how much the state knew or should have known of the risks and the risk or likelihood of foreseeable harm, and see the seriousness of the harm. And I think, well, this is very clear, of course, when it comes to the context of these camps. We know what's going on. We know the seriousness of the harm. We know the risks that are involved, but still we choose not to take this into account and take action. And this is where human rights can also kick in. And again, not only related to your own territory, but also extraterritorially.
Thank you, Christophe. And Tanya, going in order, perhaps I'll turn to you. Could you perhaps speak, is there actually any political will at the moment moving towards the establishment of a special tribunal, some sort of international tribunal to try these individuals, or has that will sort of died away and now it's a question of just various domestic governments that it would be left to them to prosecute?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. This was indeed, I mean, a big discussion, I think, more than a year ago. And it seems to be slightly faded away now into the background. And one of the obstacles is also, you know, where this tribunal has to be located, and you would need the cooperation of the state where the crimes have been committed. And I'm presuming that we are now talking about setting up a tribunal for crimes that have been committed. For example, in Iraq, you would need the cooperation of Iraq. And one of the issues which could come up very likely is that the death penalty, and that has been raised also last year, and that would make it also more complicated for certain European countries to establish such a tribunal which would use and uphold the death penalty. There are also many other arguments for not establishing such an international tribunal, that it is also very costly and it is time consuming. And in generally, they would only focus on those which bear the biggest responsibility, and that would leave all the normal foreign fighters who have also committed serious crimes unpunished. So in that sense, the option of an international tribunal is not, in my opinion, very feasible.
Thank you. Now perhaps a bit of a more broad question, perhaps for all three of you or for whoever wants to take it. So it's a two-part question. Firstly, is there a right on the part of the state to refuse a repatriation, particularly if it was requested by, let's say, the Syrian government? And also, what has been the motivating factor for the few governments that have repatriated citizens, such as Kosovo, Kazakhstan, Bosnia? What has been the difference between them and the rest of the, international community in terms of states in refusing to repatriate? Is there some sort of qualitative difference, or what's your take on that? So Tanya, do you?
Yeah, I think we all could say something about this, but I think maybe one of the issues you raised in the first part of the question, is there a right to refuse repatriation? What you do see is that a lot of European countries, when the foreign fighters and their family members are still there, that in some cases they deprive nationality. So they would apply an administrative measure, and together with the deprivation of nationality, that they are not able to enter. So if they are in the country, it would be a deportation order, but in this case, they would be refused to come back. The problem with that is also that they would also not be able to probably prosecute them anymore if they would come back. So that, as far as the repatriation, the right to refuse repatriation is concerned, but I think Christophe will also probably add to that. And the question why Kosovo and some of the other countries have done so, I think that is a very interesting question. I would like to know that myself as well. I don't know whether Anthony had an opportunity to speak to people in the government there. I mean, I have a hunch, but I see maybe if any of the other panelists would actually know for sure why they have decided to take them back.
if I can chime in, I think what also plays a role, of course, is the number of people that we're talking about. And in Kosovo, there may, of course, be fewer people involved than, for example, in France or in the UK. But I think the main point has already been mentioned by Anthony, and this is really just a lack of political will. I think if you look at all the experts that you speak, the prosecutors, they're ready to prosecute. The childcare specialists, they're ready to, to treat the children. From an international legal aspect, experts say that this is the best thing to do. From a moral perspective, the security, again, officials state that this is the wise thing to do. So it's only the politicians that are lagging behind, and this is of course also dependent on the political landscape within a certain country. With Tanya, I would love to know how we could, let's say, convince politicians the other way around. And I think there's of course a lot of talk on evidence-based policies, and this is really important to do. And I think also in this context, and you see it of course also with COVID, there's so much emphasis now on what doctors find. And I think also in this discussion, we should listen to the experts that are not limited to, say, a 4-year political mandate, but to people that look beyond such, let's say, limited periods of time. And they all indicate that this is the wiser thing to do. And if those politicians are really, let's say, in favor of an evidence-based policy approach, then they should listen to these politicians. But they're just very afraid that something will happen. And maybe just a small word on that. I think 100% security cannot be obtained ever. So even with all the security measures in the world combined, a terrorist attack may still occur. And this is just a reality that we have to live with. And I think all politicians also have a responsibility in explaining this to the public, that they cannot secure or guarantee that 100% security, and that politicians who tell otherwise are simply telling a fairy tale, in my view.
Thank you. And Anthony, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that question. No, okay. So thank you. I guess touching upon your last point, Christophe, the fact that there's really no realistic way or no possible way to ever have zero risk. I wanted to ask a question about particularly the ability to rehabilitate and reintegrate returnees, or what other steps countries should be taking. So the question is, given that there's no solid evidence, lack of evidence base for rehabilitation measures, how can we better guarantee that these individuals can be successfully repatriated without continuing to pose a risk? And what steps should governments such as the Netherlands or the UK be taking to sort of better prepare for the eventuality that people will return? So I don't know if.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in rehabilitation, but I think what is perhaps more important is, of course, a lot of talk, and Tanya mentioned it also, to what extent we can prosecute people returning, and then the point of membership of a terrorist organization has been mentioned, and that you should accumulate that with prosecution for international crimes, also because that will increase, of course, the sentence. But in the end, all these people will be released. So I think more even than focusing on a discussion on the length of the sentences, I think indeed the main problem is how to make sure that people are reintegrated peacefully back into society. And of course, also here we have experts that have done lots of studies on how different countries deal with this issue. Well, again, I'm not an expert on this, but what I've heard is that, of course, also here good practices are being shared. But the golden formula has not been found yet. Whether you should keep people on a separate wing or whether you should mingle them with the general population in a prison, that I really leave up to the expert. But the main point I would argue is to at least listen to those experts that do the research and that can come up with sound policy advice.
Thank you, Christophe. Another interesting question that we had is understanding that I think the three of you, all of our panelists today, are on one side in favor of repatriation. Are there any compelling arguments, legal or perhaps sticking to legal more than moral or political, but are there any actually compelling arguments for keeping foreign fighters and their families in Iraq and Syria versus bringing them back here? Are there any more credible counter arguments to the position that you three have taken? I don't know, Anthony, maybe, or no, Christophe, please.
The answer is absolutely not.
See if
in my view.
Oh yeah, okay, we'll see. Tanya, Anthony, I don't know if you have any other thoughts. Oh. Tanya, you're on mute. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, to be honest, I mean, I do share, I mean, the opinion with Christophe, but I do think it's also a lot to do with fear. Fear amongst general population, but also fear amongst, I mean, politicians, and a short-term vision that you're very much focused on the short-term security. And from that point of view, I can understand if that is very much on your mind. You really feel like, you know, I don't want those people here after seeing all these horrible things what they have committed, not specifically the foreign fighters we are talking about, but others. But I think the challenge is for us and for others, how we are able to break through that barrier indeed and have a discussion, but also be realistic about you know, the prospects once they're back, that it isn't going to be an easy road, neither in terms of prosecution, but also not as far as the rehabilitation is concerned. But it doesn't mean we have to shy away from our duty. But yeah, so not really giving you an answer in the sense like why we should leave them there, but maybe just alluding to some of the factors which I mean, yeah, play a role for many governments.
Thank you, Tanya. No, I appreciate both of you sort of entertaining a more counter-argument type question. So we're almost out of time. So I think maybe I'll start with Anthony. If you have any sort of final thing you would like to add before we wrap it up.
Thanks, and I'm sorry about the sound problems. I was out of commission for a little while there. But, you know, so I'm not sure if I'm repeating what others have said. I think that the reasons really, you know, I guess, you know, I think I'm probably agreeing here that it is a question of political will. This is one of those questions where, you know, the kind of weight of expert opinion is in favor of repatriation for all the reasons we've looked at. And I think you know, our audience obviously agrees, but you know, but there is this problem, and I think there's a kind of it's also rooted in a public perception that these people somehow turned their back on their country. You know, this is what often you're told. It's not as if they were just sort of ordinary criminals in some sense. They went over to a group which is, you know, a quasi-state which is bent on the destruction of our countries. And so there is, you know, I think a lot of the public you know, sense that we shouldn't repatriate is based on that picture of rejection. So I think, you know, I think politicians really need to find a language for addressing those concerns. You know, and I think, you know, we've made the rational arguments, but I think it's up to the politicians to find a way of getting that across to people, of saying, you know, that there is a responsibility. You know, it is in our best interest to address these people. And we have, you know, it's not risk-free, but we have options. So I think that's the challenge for the next period, rather than just waiting, as Christophe said, for courts to force them to come back or taking a few children here or there. I think they have to try and find a way of recasting the problem in some way. You know, that's a challenge, but it's that's what politicians should be good at, because it's a political challenge.
Thank you. And so, Christophe, did you have a further comment?
Yeah, maybe very briefly, just to follow up on that symbolic aspect. I think indeed, just like deprivation of nationality, non-repatriation, in a way is also symbolic. This saying, okay, you consciously made a decision to leave, which by the way, is not valid for all the children, of course, that were born there. But it's in a way a very symbolic measure, saying that you're out of society and we, you know, you're out and we do not want to have anything to do with you anymore. And symbolic and strong measures often do very well in political debate. But I think it was Neumann and Shiraz who had mentioned we should not look at strong or soft measures. We should look at what is smart. And I think the smart thing in the end to do, again, from a legal term perspective, is to bring them back and to prosecute them. So it's not only about the law or morality. Again, it's also in our own interest, as again mentioned by Anthony, that we bring them back and take our responsibility.
Thank you, Christophe. And so I think those are great notes to sort of leave it on, both sort of getting governments to summon the political will and also advising that we look at the evidence and we look at what is smart and what is going to be the most effective long term. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up for the time being. I wanted to, again, thank all of our panelists, certainly thank everybody who's in attendance today. As a reminder, as I mentioned, a recording will be made available. Please fill out the brief survey once you leave here, and already, if you haven't already done so, please register for the ICCT mailing list for information about future webinars and publications. And with that, have a good afternoon, everyone. Thanks.